Thank you. And thank you, gentlemen, for being here and for your work. Director Ash, I wanted to ask you, is your agency currently engaged in consultation related to the EPA's proposed new source performance standards for power plants?
We're engaged in consultation with the EPA over their proposed rule under Section 316B, the Clean Water Act, yes.
And how would you describe that level of consultation? Is it the formal consultation process?
It is a formal consultation process, yes, sir.
And how extensive has that been specifically with regard to new source performance standards for power plants?
I'm not certain how to answer your question. How, I'm not sure what you're looking for. We've been engaged in conversation with EPA.
Okay, let me back up because I think we're talking about two different things my staff just pointed out. I'm talking about new source performance standards for power plants, which is separate from 316B. So with regard to endangered species, are you engaged in consultation with EPA on new source performance standards?
I do not believe that we are, sir, but I'll have to check and make sure of that, but I do not believe that we are.
If you can check and submit that follow-up for the record.
Okay.
Assuming you're correct and you're not, why aren't you? You don't think this has any potential impact on endangered species?
The obligation for consultation, Senator, is on the action agency, so EPA would determine whether a consultation was necessary, and they would provide us with a biological assessment, which then would be the basis for a biological opinion. So your question is appropriately directed to the action agency.
Okay, I'll direct it to them, but I would point out that, for instance, in contrast to that, you're definitely involved in Section 7 consultation, for instance, in the cooling water intake rule that
Correct.
EPA.
316B, correct.
Was that initiated by EPA?
It was.
Okay. Now, I would also point out in that scenario, they are considering alternatives, all of which, both of which, I think there are two big alternatives, have a beneficial impact on endangered species. And the discussion is more or less how big the beneficial impact is. Is that correct?
No, sir. The discussion is that the permit framework under Section 316B would authorize the use of cooling waters, and which will have a significant effect on endangered and threatened and endangered species. So the discussion is about minimizing and avoiding those potential impacts and reasonable and prudent measures that the EPA and state delegated programs
But my point
can
is
take.
all the alternatives being considered are benefits compared to the status quo on endangered species.
Well, that is the purpose of a consultation, is to determine and to determine what measures can be taken by EPA within its Clean Water Act authorities to avoid and minimize the take of endangered species. Probably, sir, since the 1970s and the passage of the great environmental laws in the 1970s, everything the government does makes life better under the Clean Water Act, under the National Forest Management Act, under the Clean Air Act. The question is not whether it is one increment better. The question is, can EPA, within its discretion, undertake reasonable and prudent measures to improve the likelihood that species will be recovered?
Well, let's go back to that standard with new source performance standards, because new source performance standards fundamentally are going to shift power supply, sources for energy, and to the extent it shifts it, for instance, to wind, it takes up a whole lot more land footprint than existing sources. Is that not likely to have a major potential impact on endangered species?
It's, again, sir, it's not for me to determine. It's for the action agency to determine. In looking at their action, you're asking me a completely hypothetical question.
It's not hypothetical. It's going on, and you're the top lead actor in the federal government who's supposed to be concerned about endangered species, essentially, correct?
I am concerned about them.
Okay. So it's not hypothetical. The question is, if we're shifting power supply to things that take up a whole lot more land, could that have an impact on endangered species?
What could theoretically have an impact on endangered species. It could.
Therefore, would it be appropriate, in your opinion, I understand you don't initiate this legally, but therefore, as the person who's charged with thinking about endangered species in the federal government, would it be appropriate to think about that through a formal consultation process?
Well, it's appropriate anytime an action agency is taking an action for them to consider the effect of their action on endangered species. In fact, they have an obligation to do so under the Endangered Species Act. But it's their call.
It's their
call and it's their
legal responsibility. It's
to do
their
that.
call. I'm asking the question, are they making the right call by not initiating any consultation process with you on the matter?
That's not for me to say, sir.
Okay. Well, if I can just wrap up, I think it's collectively for us to say, and I think clearly this major rulemaking has a broad potential impact on endangered species. And I think clearly the lack of any consultation is completely inappropriate.
Senator Sessions.